I have spoken about the fact that I had a religious conversion experience in 1979, and I further have described the fact that at that time I studied various religious and mystical traditions before settling upon Mahayana Buddhism as the tradition that most resonated with my own experience of relief from anxiety and attainment of tranquility or peace of mind. At that time, I was living in the Bible Belt of the United States of America, and in the context of wanting to communicate some way or other a sense of this spiritual path that I felt had value and was worthy of communicating to people around me, I put together a small book with illustrations by a friend of mine pertaining to Jesus, the story of Jesus and interpretation. What I did basically, I think, was integrate the narrative of the story of Jesus as described in one of the books of the New Testament, and embedded within that Buddhist notions, Mahayana Buddhist notions in particular, pertaining to the Bodhisattva path and the great vehicle teaching that the intent of the Buddha was for all beings to become Buddhas. Well, this was rather presumptuous, and I won't replicate the precise content of that little book, but it is an interesting question fundamentally as to whether it is legitimate and reasonable to think from a Buddhist perspective of Jesus as a bodhisattva. I've made a number of videos about the Bodhisattva path, and I won't get into all that detail except in the context of this current reference or analogy that I'll be drawing. I started the book with just the basics of Jesus being born in Bethlehem, being the son of Mary, and talking about Mary looking upon young Jesus as the future Savior, and referenced the narrative that about age 30 Jesus went before John the preacher. I indicated that in the presence of John, Jesus humbly expressed his submission to the will of God the Father. I think this notion of submission is one that those with Christian backgrounds can determine whether or not it's within the context of the Christian theology and belief systems, but I think at a fundamental level it represents minimizing our own ego, realizing that we are not the most important creature in the universe, and that there is a much broader universe of which we are a part, which is not to say we're not important as individuals, but that somehow or other to subsume our will to a larger dynamic or flow may be an important element in our movement along this spiritual path. My projection onto Jesus was that at that time he vowed to save beings, and as Sakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha, did, to save beings from the suffering of ignorance, old age, disease, and death. So somehow or other I got the idea that John declared the pure-mindedness of Jesus, and then God sanctified Jesus to fulfill the role of Savior. It was my recollection just from reviewing the content of this little book that Jesus at that time went off alone, and I had him practicing discipline, meditation, and wisdom. These are certainly some of the key elements within Buddhist practice, particularly meditation, which then, as I've indicated in other videos, can give us a glimpse of prajna or wisdom, or that awareness that our conceptual way of breaking reality down into this versus that is illusory, that in a more fundamental sense there is an interconnectedness that we can become aware of by focusing on the breath and not getting pulled along by the thought stories that tend to dominate our consciousness. Jesus was apparently tempted at that time in various ways, but held firm, knowing that, as I phrased it, that devotion to God's will is more important than physical comfort and survival. And, certainly there are many stories about bodhisattvas making sacrifices in the context of their desire to help sentient beings reduce their level of suffering. If through this process a bodhisattva can free himself from ignorance, attachment, and selfish desire, if he or she can give up clinging to ego and such ideas as existence or non-existence, then the notion is that a person can be, if you want to put it this way, filled with the wisdom and compassion of God. So then, of course, Jesus, by the Sea of Galilee, begins his wonderful ministry. And what I have him preaching there, the bliss of heaven is real. And that, of course, is consistent with what you've heard me talk about and, so to speak, preach about on many occasions regarding my own perspective and worldview, which is the Shin Buddhist worldview, that there is a force in the universe which I label as Amida Buddha, who in a previous incarnation as a bodhisattva was able to accumulate vast amounts of merit in order to have the power to fulfill his profound vow that when he became a Buddha, anybody that had faith in him, believed in him, said his name only once, could be reborn at the time of death in his pure land of bliss, which, of course, is totally analogous, I think, to Christian heaven. Anyone can enter heaven by God's grace. And Shin Buddhism, or Jodo Shinshu, true Pure Land Buddhism, is, as the excellent Shin Buddhist author, Western advocate of Shin Buddhism, Alfred Bloom, has said in the title to his key book, that Shin Buddhism is a method of pure grace. So then I get into Jesus gathering disciples, his fame growing, and giving the Sermon on the Mount, where I have him sharing his understanding of God's profound law. I'll just pull out a couple of excerpts there. And these are things to reflect upon in terms of, whether they represent transcendent kinds of notions that, are worthy of reflection and contemplation regardless of one's theological or religious heritage and belief system. The notion that no being is totally separate from the rest. While any suffer, all have cause for sorrow. The notion that eventually wisdom and compassion will prevail. The notion that anger causes pain. The anger one feels as if in hell. The victim suffers too. Anger is like a harmful poison. Greed is also like a harmful poison. Purity of mind brings happiness, peace, and joy. And of course, this is a reference to the Buddhist notion of the three poisons, which are anger, greed, and ignorance. Ignorance being the delusion that we are separate beings. So, in this context, I have Jesus indicating that, quote, the development of love and compassion is the key to your progress on the spiritual path. Look at God's example. God loves all alike, regardless of behavior. He wishes to save all from suffering and teach all to become like Him. And then I go on, because you'll recall in the Lotus Sutra, the parable on the rain of the law, nurturing the herbs, the trees, the various grasses, etc. And that's my belief, is that what God or Buddha can be doing on our behalf is basically teaching us, giving us teaching messages. So I'm saying here that God sends His teaching messages constantly to every single person, to every single living being. He shines his bright light of wisdom into each. He rains the compassionate rain of his supreme law onto each taking in what is needed to grow. Each grows according to ability and aspiration. God serves as the model for each of us to follow. God is infinitely compassionate and good. And as the Christians say, and is certainly profoundly true, God is love. I have the message articulated beyond this point to the effect that there are great dangers of pride in following the spiritual path. Trungpa's wonderful book on the potential pitfalls of spiritual materialism is a very worthwhile text in this regard. I note that there is temptation to push specific ideas about religion onto others. Each person adopts a concept of God that meets his needs for comfort and spiritual growth at the stage he is at. God views all seekers as equal regardless of stage. He preaches the law equally to all. And this is certainly a message that has resonance and relevance in the context of our current world situation and the history of the world, frankly, where people with more fundamentalistic orientations want to put forward the proposition that only their particular belief system is an accurate portrayal of the divine. But, this gets back to the notion that, no concept system can accurately portray reality with a capital R or truth with a capital T. So, any proposition by humans, whether as an individual or in a group, that their way is the only way, to my mind, falls flat in terms of having any validity. And not only that, is a basis then for hostility and conflict, violence and killing. And we see that, again, even today. And we've seen it throughout history of Homo sapiens. I then go on to indicate that giving alms generously and joyfully is a primary moral virtue. And of course this relates to the 6 paramitas that I've spoken of, the first of which is dana, or giving, or charity. This is primary, but I indicate that boasting about your generosity is a sign of pride. Being self-righteous within your own mind is also a sign of pride. And if you yield to pride, you will shut off your view of God's light. I go on to talk a little bit about prayer. Prayer is an interesting topic. Within Jodo Shinshu, we say the Nambutsu, Namo Amida Butsu, which is an expression of gratitude for the gift we've been given, based on Amida Buddha's vow that we are embraced, never to be abandoned, and that we will be reborn in his pure land, even in spite of our ignorance, anger, and greed, which cannot be fully transcended in this life unless we are a Jesus or a Shakyamuni Buddha. Shin Buddhists don't believe in prayer that, so to speak, produces results in this world, but it's a way of expressing our sympathy and our relationship with the divine. What I indicate in here is that in your prayers, call upon the name of God, which again in Shin Buddhism is Amida Buddha. Affirm your dependence on him, again reducing our own sense of ego importance. Tell God of your vow to relieve suffering. That's always good. In other words, even though we don't have to be good in order to be saved, why not do the best we can? Why not make that vow analogous to the Bodhisattva's vow to save all beings? Of course, the Bodhisattva recognizes at the same time that there are no beings, in the sense that there are no separate persons. We are all interconnected, which is the basis of Mahayana Buddhism, that we all need to get in that great big ship to get across that sea of suffering to the other shore of peace and tranquility. Ask God for forgiveness for any wrongs you have done, and tell God how you're doing at forgiving others. Thank God in your prayers for all he provides. God assures you safe passage to heaven. He deserves your eternal praise and devotion. I go on to talk about everything that money can buy being temporary, and the true happiness and peace can only be found on the spiritual path. And that's pretty well documented even in psychological studies where, yeah, up to a certain point, you need a certain amount of money in order to have certain basic comforts. But beyond that point, it doesn't produce greater happiness. You can experience God's bright light of wisdom. His infinite light shines equally through each person. Infinite light. Now, Amida, his two actual names are Amitayus and Amitabha. Amitayus is infinite life, meaning compassion, that he's here forever as a source of comfort. Infinite light, I think, is a symbol for wisdom. And many of Amida's titles pertain to the notion of light, as I indicated in a recent video about his various titles. So it is ignorance, anger, and greed that dim the vision of living beings, and where there is darkness, there is suffering. Each person sets priorities among material world values and spiritual path values. Do you seek only temporary pleasures, or do you also seek the joy of eternal bliss? Do you work only for yourself, or do you also work for the welfare of others? And again, this isn't to lay a guilt trip on anybody or tell you shoulds or shouldn'ts or whatever, because karma to some extent dictates, what we're capable of doing. But we do still have, I think, some choices about what we focus on and what we choose to do. It's just that we don't want to, or I don't want to, kick myself too hard if I'm not able to attain the level of perfection of behavior that I can imagine would be the ideal. So Jesus finishes this Sermon on the Mount and then goes on to teach and to heal. And I put in a paragraph that I think is pretty important in terms of, again, this fundamental notion of no particular conceptual system being the ultimate, so to speak, when I indicate that to an expert on the existing laws, Jesus taught that he did not rely on any specific doctrine. His mind did not abide anywhere. Jesus did not cling to any particular concepts. He transcended all dualistic limitations. He taught tactfully according to the needs of people. So just to unpack that a little bit, in some of the Buddhist sutras, I'm thinking now of the Diamond Sutra, the Buddha asks his disciple point blank, have I taught any Dharma? And the answer is basically no. In other words, and in the early Pali teachings, there's the notion of a raft that, you want and need the raft to get across. But, once you've crossed, you don't need the raft anymore. You don't put it on your back and carry it with you. You leave it there. And as far as transcending dualistic limitations, I think I mentioned in one of the other videos that I'm now attending a group at an Episcopal church called Going Deeper. And, I think there is now, since the 70s, a movement spearheaded by Thomas Keating for Christians to increasingly recognize that what I think they call non-dual consciousness is worth trying to get in touch with, through contemplative meditation kinds of techniques, contemplative prayer. Richard Rohr, Cynthia Bourgeault, these are some of the people that are very appropriately touting this kind of new direction within Christianity, which is actually an old direction from the standpoint that this was some of the approach back in the, around the Middle Ages, maybe the 13th century. So Jesus taught his disciples to zealously follow the same path he was on. That meant giving up attachments. And that, of course, ties back to the early Buddhist teaching, the Four Noble Truths, the fact that there is suffering, the notion that the cause of suffering is having attachments, that we can give up attachments, and that the way to do that was articulated by the Buddha as the Eightfold Path. This next paragraph is very important, that Jesus taught that God is infinitely merciful. And I think here of Kuan Yin being the embodiment, the Bodhisattva of infinite compassion. Speaking of God, he loves and wants to save even those whose character is most unlike his own. He knows and has compassion for the suffering of such beings. And, this hits right on with Shinran, the 13th century founder of Shin Buddhism. His notion that Amida Buddha's vow, Dharmakara's vow, who ultimately became Amida Buddha, it actually, according to the Tanisho, which was a description of Shinran's teachings by one of his disciples, makes the point very explicitly that the vow was mostly created for evil people, that no evil can block the potency, the effectiveness of Amida Buddha's vow, that simply saying his name one time provides that assurance that we will be reborn in his pure land of bliss. Making reference to two of the other elements within the six paramitas, I indicate that practice patience and zeal in disregard of whatever persecution or setbacks you may face, that this is what he's telling his disciples. So again, these are two: patience, kshante, which I've talked about before, and zeal. These perfections or paramitas, these are the ways that the Bodhisattva practices to fulfill his or her vows to save beings. So I have Jesus going on to tell the people that the light of God's wisdom, which again is prajna, can be seen within the mind of each person. Each can see its results in his or her own life. The truth of God's wisdom is beyond the intellect. It cannot be fully grasped by word or thought. It must be experienced. Speaking now of the spiritual path, I express the notion that if a man or woman genuinely follows the spiritual path, he will eventually realize that man-made laws and rituals do not have absolute authority. In God's eyes, human laws have only relative validity. Some may be very good as far as they go, but it is possible to see the law beyond such laws as one becomes more and more aware of God's ultimate wisdom. God shares his wisdom equally with each person. He hopes that humans will thus be influenced to create fair and meaningful laws and rituals which will serve to promote spiritual development. God hopes humans will change laws and rituals that have become rigid and harmful to the welfare of living beings. God's interest is always to relieve suffering and to teach the living how to be like him. Further, there's the teaching that God's kingdom is one whole. And by the way, I don't endorse the notion, frankly, at this point, of sort of a total unity, or there being a notion of one whole per se. In other words, it's like it's said in the Heart Sutra, form is void and void is form, meaning that, it's an illusion that we have an independent existence because there is this interconnectedness, but at the same time, we also do have a certain type of individuality in the context of our everyday lives and everyday experience of suchness, of the reality of the here and now, as Thich Nhat Hanh would say. Here's the notion that the apparent divisions, in other words, the separations between us, as we emphasize the aspect of the whole, are created by the thinking mind. Discrimination is the root of all ignorance and suffering. There are no absolute separations between people or things. Nothing exists in totally independent form. The view of a world filled with particulars is an illusion. Now again, I don't view that as absolutely true either, but it's to try to get across in words some of the essence or notion of sunyata, or emptiness. The light of God's wisdom reveals the truth of reality. To allow God's wisdom and grace to come into awareness, a person must find ways to keep thoughts from blocking the light. And of course, within the teaching of Mahayana, in particular the Lotus Sutra, which is a system of universal salvation, we could say that a person can either follow the spiritual path of wisdom and compassion or try to disregard the correct and true path in order to pursue the pleasures of this or that temporary illusion. But God forgives all. He loves all equally, and eventually, and this is the point, he will save all and teach all. Every person will someday enter heaven's bliss. Every person will someday be perfected. That, by the way, I think, according to a friend of mine, is also consistent with the Baha'i belief that we, Homo sapiens, are in a positive trajectory. I know it doesn't seem like that many times, but it's kind of an optimistic perspective because, everybody does have the Buddha nature. Everybody does have the divine spark within them. So there are negative consequences of negative thoughts and behaviors. This is basically karma. People create painful consequences for themselves. Consequences follow from behavior. And there's an important point here that I don't believe, and I think it's an aberration for belief systems that view God as punishing human beings. Painful consequences are not a result of God's wishes. God has only compassion and mercy for people in their predicament. People created the present problems through their past ignorance and hard-heartedness. The foundations must be laid now for goodness to prevail later. And this is just a simple statement of causes and conditions, causes and effects, that I think does have validity as a principle within the human sphere. So the implications of some of what we've been saying here is that each person is equal to all others in spiritual nature and potential. People vary only in their degree of realizing their own divine nature. All living beings have the inherent capacity to reach the final state of spiritual perfection. All will eventually reach fruition, thanks to the saving and teaching power of God. The basic nature of everyone is divine. Jesus used many tactful ways to teach this supreme law. He taught according to the abilities of people to hear and understand. And of course, this ties directly back to Chapter 2 of the Lotus Sutra, where we have the teaching of the Buddha's use of tactful or expedient means to relate to people in accordance with their own psychologies, their own abilities and ways of understanding. A profound teaching that is articulated in parable form with the burning house parable in Chapter 3 of the Lotus Sutra. Skipping over some of the biographical narrative, but I have at some point Jesus advising people to pay attention to meaningful laws, preaching that a person should not kill, should not steal, should not lie, should not engage in adultery, and should not slander the law of God or the teachers of the law. Angry and greedy thoughts also defile. So, these are some of the basic principles of moral behavior that are appropriately touted by all positive-oriented religions. And again, sila or precepts is one of the 6 paramitas for the Bodhisattva. I know that a lot of Buddhists aren't big on the idea of faith, but I really do think there's, I obviously think that there's a legitimate devotional or faith-oriented approach within Buddhism. And in that sense, Christianity's exclusive emphasis on faith really helps highlight the importance of it. And certainly Jesus, I think, emphasized faith as necessary for spiritual strength. He taught people to cultivate humility and to become childlike in their trust of God's mercy. Jesus also emphasized forgiveness of others. Even if wronged hundreds of times, a person should ideally continue to forgive from his heart. Now, here, again in 1980, when I was into the Pure Land approach, but not fully on board with the true Pure Land approach, if you will, I indicate in the teaching here that people can obtain rebirth in heaven where they gradually become perfect like God. In heaven there are no hindrances to learning. And this is basically the teaching again in the earlier form of Pure Land Buddhism, where in a way it was like if you focused on Amida Buddha, recited his name, meditated on Amida, contemplated his Pure Land, and particularly said his name at the time of your death, then you could be reborn in the Pure Land, and it was almost like attending a graduate program in a university. You were free of some of the hindrances that kept you from being as able to fulfill those meditative and non-meditative practices, but you still had a ways to go before you became Buddha. What Shinran said is, one thought of faith, one episode of saying the name of Amida. That's all that was required, and that was it. There were no further practices required, A, and B, when you died, you didn't get into a situation where you still had further to go to advance. You immediately became a Buddha. And within Shinran's teaching, at that point in time, you had the option to come back as a Bodhisattva to help beings relieve their suffering in this world in various forms, in a manner that you didn't have the capability of doing. Even though you might feel the compassion and the desire to help, in this human form, we just, we have many limitations, particularly if we're householders, trying to raise a family or work in the world to make our living. And so that was the difference between the early form of Pure Land Buddhism and Shinran's refinement of it into a method of pure grace. In a way, the point is that the way of virtue is not the only way to heaven. God, in His compassionate mercy, has provided an easy way. And again, within Buddhism, we have a lot of history of the whole issue of the path of sages, or the difficult way, versus the easy path. We're saying here that God saves all who truly believe in Him and His divine grace. Any who have such faith will go to heaven, and in heaven all is bliss. Because God is infinitely kind, even those who come to God late in life will be granted entrance to heaven. God will appear before believers at the moment of their death. As they worship God, their thoughts will not be troubled. And of course, death is something that we all contemplate and have concerns about. And there was a phase in Pure Land Buddhism when, I think obviously you must know from looking at my videos that I'm into Asian art, where the paintings were the so-called Rego type Pure Land paintings, where the painting was of Amida Buddha coming down from the Pure Land, flanked by a whole retinue of bodhisattvas, musicians. And of course his primary two attendants were Mahastama Prompta, representing wisdom, and Kuan Yin, or the regarder of the cries of the world, Avalokiteshvara, representing infinite compassion. And Avalokiteshvara, of course, carried the lotus throne onto which the believer was born when they died. This last, most important message, consistent with what I've been saying up till now, is that the easy way is real and valid. No one should confuse or interfere with the simplicity and sureness of this way. It must not be narrowed. Direct appeal to God by faith results in salvation. Sincere seekers will enter heaven. They will be given eternal happiness. And then at a broader level, there will come a time when the peace and love of God's kingdom will fill the universe. God rejoices in the thought of universal freedom from suffering.